And welcome to the fourth meeting of 2025 of the SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee. I have received no apologies for today's meeting. Today the committee will take evidence from the Scottish Information Commissioner and then the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner. I welcome to the committee first David Hamilton, Scottish Information Commissioner, and we'll move straight to questions if that's okay. So the first question is from myself, and it's quite a generic one, and I appreciate you've given us a written submission, which we're very grateful for. But the first question is, what do you consider to be your purpose as the Information Commissioner? And how does that differ from the role of, say, ministers, MSPs or other bodies?
Thank you and good morning, Committee. The Scottish Information Commissioner follows an international model of best practice. And that is where you have an independently appointed office holder who considers appeals of freedom of information requests that the public have against public bodies. That includes everything from GP surgeries right up to, of course, Scottish Government, NHS boards, local authorities. So the importance of the role is that it is independent and that independence is enshrined by the way of the appointment. And it is something which we, as current Commissioner and my predecessors, have taken very seriously in terms of making sure that we operate and make our operational decisions on an independent basis. The role was established 2002 by the Act then, but really came into force 2005. In those 20 years, the office has been based at St Andrews, and there's been a very specialist staff of about 28 investigators and some support functions based there. There have been about 10,000 decisions have been put out in that time from the office, and that's over dealing with about 1.4 million requests of made for freedom of information across the country. So it's been a well-established, it's well-bedded in, it's, I'd like to think, well-running. In terms of how we operate, and I've got a very experienced and dedicated staff who I'm eternally grateful because they keep me right, but they also have a corporate memory that is really exceptional. And this is not the first time that this topic has been examined, and again, being able to draw on their experience from what they've seen in the past has been very helpful for me.
Thank you. And you said in your written submission, there was the paragraph elaborates on this first sentence, but I think this first sentence captures what I think you're trying to emphasise to us, which is, from a functional perspective, I think I stand both alone in the public sector landscape and alone in the Commissioner landscape. I wondered if you wanted to say a bit more about that.
I think one of the things I would say, it's a general theme about the considerations I've seen so far, is it would be a mistake to lump commissioners as I think I said a homogenous entity was the phrase I used. I'm a commissioner by the fact I've got a royal commission from the King. That's about it, and I get funded by the Parliament body. That's the crossover I have with other commissioners. Some of the other commissioners have advocacy rights, some have regulatory results or standards, for example. My role is quite separate in terms of it's a quite distinct function. And it also is different in the fact that it has statutory powers. I act as a quasi-judicial body. If people appeal my decisions, it's straight to the inner house, which is, again, a high standard. So I've got to investigate and regulate. It is one part of the job. The other part of the job is promoting the freedom of information regime. And, of course, that coverage expands across my fellow office holders, as well as it does the parliamentary body. So it's, I've had to do a number of decisions where I've had to judge on the people who are funding me, which again is a slightly unusual position, but there are very, very clear lines of demarcation that are respected by both parties in that as to what that means and looks like.
And in that context, how do you perceive the current role of yourself, and if you want to comment more widely, SPCB supported bodies in enhancing public trust and confidence in public life in Scotland?
Well, I think freedom of information is probably one of the most strongest kernels of accountability and of course, transparency that we have in a democracy. And I think even listening to what's happening just now, the talk about Doge and the Scottish version of Doge, use of freedom of information being used as a way of holding government and authorities to account. It shows that it's an important tool within that. Interestingly, it's also important, I do note that Doge in the States is trying to excuse itself from FOI legislation there, which again shows you that there's another side to that in terms of it's a powerful piece of legislation that people both fear and value. So I think that the role there is particularly strong, and the legislation is particularly important, and it's something which we see emerging democracies aspiring to bring in and to replicate. And I'm glad to see often coming to Scotland and basing their new models based upon what we've done in Scotland, because we are seen as a global leader.
Lorna Slater has a supplementary.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm interested in just following up on something you've said there. I absolutely understand your cautioning us around lumping all the various commissioners together. Completely understand that. I suppose looking at the landscape, one of the ways to look at it is those that are involved in the public trust and those that are more primarily advocacy. Now, clearly, Information Commission, along with Ombudsman and so on, is really important for public trust. Some of the other witnesses that we've had during this have talked about the importance for their role of the separation between an investigative role and an adjudication role. Can you clarify, because I think it sounds like you do both investigation and adjudication, could you just outline that and why that's particularly important to your role?
Yes, certainly. So when people have a complaint, if they're not happy and satisfied with the way that an authority has dealt with the request for information, of course, first of all, they appeal to the authority, they review that. The next stage is that people have the right to come to me to look at that. I then, my staff need to then ingest all the information, apply the law to that and consider that. And sometimes that requires us to investigate further and to probe further. I suppose in many ways the same way as this committee is doing in terms of trying to understand the issues better. And then on an FOI appeal, we would look at that, get the information and then apply law to it. And that's our kind of role. So there's an investigative element, which is inquiring as to why a decision has been taken, and then we make an adjudication upon that. That is very, very much valued by people. The independence of my office is hugely important, and it's something that I think in the last year, since I've been in post, year and 3 months, there's been a lot of attention on particular topics, which I think really are perhaps indicative. And I would like to think that certainly people appreciate the fact that I take an independent view on this. It doesn't matter who it is, what it is that's getting looked at. I need to have that, and I need to have confidence within that. So the importance for me is that people have confidence in the quality of my decision making as much as it is in the quantity. And that's something we are very focused in the office on, and making sure that it's defendable and stateable in our decisions.
I absolutely understand the importance of the independence. When we were speaking with the Commissioner for Ethical Standards and the Standards Commission, they were talking about the importance to them of separating out the investigative role and the adjudication role. But for your role, the two are combined. And I'm just trying to understand why it's different for them than it is for you.
Yeah, so I think it's different in the sense that I guess it's a bit like the police and the Crown Office. So that the as I understand it, and I'm certainly no expert in this, but the ethical standards would do investigation, and then Standards Committee would judge upon that. What I'm doing is I'm judging, but as part of that judging process, I often need to do investigations to understand and to look further behind what's going on there. Beyond that, I do have powers which are legally enforceable powers, whether that be for criminal offences, whether that be for powers of search, which I can execute. So that's all framed within the context of trying to make an adjudication and to make a decision. It's not something where somebody comes to me and says, I want you to investigate this. They've got to present me with the case, and then as part of my judicial investigation, if you like, I may ask for different questions. It may take me down other routes, and asking for additional information that allows me to make a judgment upon the particular challenge that's been put forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I now turn to Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Hamilton. The committee is interested in looking at the case for creation of new commissioners, but also at the landscape of existing commissioners. And I think you said in response to the convener's questions a moment ago that if I read it in your briefing, it's a mistake to lump commissioners together as homogenous entities because, as you fairly said, they're very different roles. We're hearing this morning from yourself and then the Biometrics Commissioner. I mean, in your view, is there any synergy between the work that you do and the work the Biometrics Commissioner does?
None at all. And it was actually something that I think came up at the Finance Committee, and we kind of were scratching our heads thinking we don't see how that one fits. Again, I think a lot of people misunderstand that my role is not to do with data protection. It is purely about the release of information, that freedom of information. Whereas I think ICO, the Information Commissioner Office for the UK, is taking an interest in biometrics. And I don't know what the interface there is between Scottish Biometrics Commissioner and ICO. But I think there's also somebody else, I think it was a Equality and Human Rights Commission, which again is a UK-based organisation. And I think that's where probably more synergies sit within that. Again, the closest thing I have in the UK to an organisation like mine is the Information Commissioner's Office UK-wide. But even then, that's the FOI function, which they deal with, it is a small part of, quite an enormous organisation. So, in terms of your question is, do I see any synergies with anyone? Not at all. If there was something, I would have certainly highlighted that, but we had a conversation with that and said, no, don't see it.
Okay. All right, thank you. That's very helpful. We'll be putting the same question to the Biometrics Commissioner when he or she appears. We're interested in looking at the arguments around creation of new commissioners. And I know when you say in your written submission that's not something you want to talk very much about, but I don't have any views that you want to share with the committee around that. Because, as you probably know, there's a number of proposals in train at the moment, some in the parliamentary process to create new commissioners, mainly in the advocacy space.
So I can give you an observational perspective, probably more though as David Hamilton as opposed to the Scottish Information Commissioner, and that's the danger, because you want to hear from the Scottish Information Commissioner. Because I have so little to do functionally with the other commissioners, it's very hard. I don't actually know what they do, to be honest, because I don't need to. They do their job, and I know broadly speaking of it, but I don't know in detail what it is. I would say in general, I have of course read the recommendations of, I think it was Session 2 Finance Committee, which made out some criteria, and I think I said in my evidence that made intrinsic sense, what was put there in terms of looking at it. I'm not sure the Parliament has necessarily followed that, to be honest, as through the years. But that is what that is. I also would suggest that what I see in my own workload just now is a growing distrust and weariness in institutions, and that's fuelled both by perhaps the political climate, but also by financial cuts to services, and people are getting angrier and more annoyed and are beginning to lose trust in some of the more established institutions. And when people do that, that's when you start looking for who's going to take this forward for me. Let's have a look at, I need a commissioner to do this, I need a commissioner to do that. Now, there are big questions here, and I think, to be honest, in terms of the remit of the committee, I think the Parliament has maybe missed a trick here in terms of the narrowness of it, because I think the big benefits are going to be across the whole sector. I don't understand how, for example, we can look at the Scottish Children's and Young Persons Commissioner and the funding for that, for example, and structure for that, without considering that in the context of the third sector, which is hugely supported by the public money. And I think this is the thing that I kind of looking at this thinking, I'm not quite, I think it's slightly unambitious. There are a lot of things that could be done looking at the big picture, and I think what I've seen from Ivan McKee's work has been impressing me, because it's really pulling it together, because frankly, what we have seems to be unaffordable. And we need to sort of start looking at where we can see this. But it needs to be a whole system look, not just on a small piece. And I know that's not particularly helpful for a committee. It's been given a remit by the Parliament. But in terms of observations, that's what I would probably say from looking from the outside is that a bit of a missed opportunity.
No, thank you for that. And I mean, what you've said is very much in line with some of the evidence that the Finance and Public Administration Committee heard when they took evidence on this. And the drive towards creating commissioners was driven to an extent by the frustration people feel about public services. But we will consider that as a committee. Let me just ask you one more thing, if I can, and that's about the location of the office, because St Andrews is a town I know very well. It's part of the region I represent. Lovely place, but also it's a very expensive location in terms of the cost of property. Some of the most expensive streets in Scotland are in St Andrews. Is St Andrews really the best place to have a public body like yourselves? Would there not be more cost-effective options, even within Fife? I'm very keen representing Fife, that the organisation stays in Fife, but is St Andrews really the best place?
Well, I think first of all I'd say is that compared to other places like Edinburgh, it's a fraction of the cost.
Well, there's more to Scotland than Edinburgh.
There is indeed, but I think in terms of where the property sits, we are on a lease, so it's a rented accommodation. It's a long-term lease, so even the process of moving would be expensive, and again I would ask what the value for that would be. There's always a danger when you have upset with location as to what does that mean for your staff. Do you retain them? Do you keep them? And in an organisation as small as mine, it's really the criticality of losing staff, particularly experienced staff, could have a devastating impact on the regulatory system. My strong advocacy would be to retain the premises there, because it actually costs very little in terms of the cost of things. What I have been keen to do is explore, and I've offered this up to the corporate body, if there are new commissioners, to explore opportunities of co-sharing with space there. But again, I also think that this is where the scope of things. I'd also want to look at if this was something that was forced upon me, then I would be looking at, well, what other options have we got of co-sharing with other public authorities? So, for example, Fife Council have got a footprint in North East Fife that we would explore that, because, and I mentioned this at the Standards Committee. I go past Edinburgh City Council coming down here, and it's empty. And you look in the windows, and there's all these empty desks. Now, ironically, I went past today, and they put screens up. So I don't know if they're listening, but I think that the capacity within the public bodies for space is there. It just needs to be slotted in with that. I think the mistake is trying to, again, compartmentalise things into too few organisations and saying, well, we could do that, we could do this. I'm always looking for savings. I'm always looking for efficiencies. I had even talked about getting permission to sublet if I had some spare space within my office. But what I have seen is, in the last year, my staff attendance rate has tripled in terms of office, following COVID. So we're seeing a change in culture now, where people are coming back to the office, and we're making the office a welcoming place where we can get people getting value from being together again, which is great to see. It's really put a vibe in the office, and it's increasing performance. The fact that people are happy to be there and exchanging views, there's no question of that. The difficulty with that is that now is what we call car park wars have started again, in terms of it's been so successful that car parking can be a struggle, and we get back to all those kind of issues. So it's a positive picture in terms of occupancy, and I would say that probably I'm less able to share than I was last year, because I had a fairly empty office last year. Now we've got a fairly busy office, and I think the opportunities are diminished, but not something that I would rule out, because I do appreciate the importance of minimising costs.
Okay, thank you. If only we had a train station in St Andrews. That's a debate for another day, I think, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I go to colleagues, just picking up on a couple of points there, I thought it was interesting that you talked about how the work of other commissioners was not necessarily what you were familiar with, and that's fully understandable. But I think one point that was clear in your earlier remarks was just how comprehensive your role is. I think the example you used was GPs all the way up to the Scottish Government and across the public sector. And I don't know if you want to say a bit more about that, because I think that is a differential with some others. And the other point you talked about, to use the phrase, the big picture and a whole system. And thanks for citing the example of third sector funding. But do you think that as we look at our work and what we've been tasked with regard to the SPCB commissioners, we also need to see that in the context of all the other different commissioners and public bodies that provide a similar function, that are funded by Scottish Government rather than by the Parliament corporate body?
I think that's the nub of it. I mean, the thing that astonished me when I took this post was the sheer number of public authorities and public bodies and public companies that are in existence. I mean, I think we have about 600 that report to us in terms of their freedom of information perspective, but that's just the top ones. You know, we don't go to every GP surgery asking for data returns. It would be unreasonable to do so. But you know, there literally are hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of public bodies, and I don't even know what I keep finding new ones because we've got to consider them, and you get things like the pub codes adjudicator. Who knew what that was? There's the smart card users group or something like that. I mean, I'm sure they're all doing important jobs, but it's just that such a hidden group of, you know, complicated landscape across the whole public sector with this, and that's just in organisations I'm aware of. But when I look at the third sector support is another thing. So when we get other organisations that are supported by Scottish Government, by legislation to deliver services, that's again another whole sector there, which I think you need to look at the whole thing in the round and saying, well, I mean, there's probably duplication going on, probably just by sheer volume of organisations, and I think that's just where the real efficiencies sit in terms of can we understand this, because I don't even think there's a map that explains it all. I had the same chat with the Auditor General, and we were talking about this, and you know, we were exchanging. It's like, you know, public authority bingo, sort of trying to exchange. Have you heard of this one? Have you heard of that one? And so now our offices are working together to try and, or shortly to work together to try and exchange information as to understanding all the different organisations that are out there, and we have different views. I mean, he has a different interest in terms of his auditing functions. Mm-hmm. I've got an interest in the freedom of information functions. So it is a very complicated landscape, and I think there's a department in the Scottish Government for public bodies, but I haven't yet discovered who that is or where that is.
Well, we'll be speaking to the Scottish Government and the Auditor General in the weeks ahead, so you've maybe provided us with some direction there. So thank you very much. Lorna Slater.
Thank you. Obviously, this committee has been convened because of the complication in the landscape, and I absolutely note your remarks. It's something we've discussed as well, that the wider picture is relevant and, of course, may form part of our recommendations, although we have a very limited remit and timeframe and resources for a very specific bit of work here. I'm interested in, you alluded briefly to an international model. So I think it was the UK model where the freedom of information functions is inside a kind of wider information commissioner. And I'm just wondering if there are other international models, because I understand what you're saying about the uniqueness of your role, totally get about the independence required. I'm just thinking in terms of structure. In a perfect world, or if you were starting from than where we are starting, is there another model that works, that has been shown to work in other countries, or is this a role that always needs to be completely alone from other bodies of public trust?
So there are countries that have tried to incorporate the function in other organisations, but one of the things, I think Mexico's the most recent example of it that I'm aware of anyway, but that has caused problems because, first of all, there's a credibility aspect there as to So who's actually making the decision? Who are you accountable to? I mean, the strength of my post in my office is that it is essentially accountable financially to the Parliament and governance of the Parliament, but it is accountable essentially to the people through the courts for decisions. And that is such an important aspect of this, because if as soon as you start getting other governance on top of it, then you get into question marks as to is that the right thing to do? Who's actually making the decision? We use the United Nations development programmes. I think it's the United Nations development programme. It's one of the United Nations agencies. There's a complicated landscape. One of the United Nations agencies has an RTI rating, which is rights to information, and they rank different countries based upon their legislative frameworks and their structures, and the independent commissioner is a significant score within that. And we would see a degradation in that, which, again, is something which would be a great shame, because we have an international standing which I can genuinely say is second to none. Having met a lot of my international colleagues, they come up and speak very fondly of my predecessors and the help that they have done in building their organisations and democracies. So it is something that I think to do so would damage both the legislation, it would damage the trust that the public have, and indeed public authorities have in the system, and it would also do us quite significant damage on an international perspective in terms of, are we seen as a transparent regime?
Sorry, two kind of follow-up questions to that. One is, and again, you alluded to it maybe a little bit earlier, is specifically around the naming commissioner, because there are things within the supported bodies that are commissioners and things that are not, ombudsman, and things without the SPCB supported bodies that have that name commissioner. Do you feel like that the word commissioner, the title commissioner, is a useful one for describing your role, or indeed all the roles that are covered by that title?
Certainly internationally, it's recognised as it's International Committee of Information Commissioners.
Right. Okay.
So it is across the world that exists. I think perhaps the problem is, because it's been in existence for so long, 20 years, that when other functions have come along, particularly advocacy functions, they've used the name commissioner, which I can understand why that was done, but I think the problem is it's confused it as well. And actually, when you look at, I'm sure you have evidence from the Scottish Human Rights Commission, where I think there's 3 or 4 commissioners there, and it's, everyone's got a different governance model. And it's really just trying to pick your way through that as to what does it mean. So it's not helpful in terms of people asking questions as to the commissioners. It sounds like a band, but there isn't a grouping of that. It's just, I happen to be a commissioner, somebody else happens to be a commissioner, but they're not the same commissioner.
And my final question then is, taking a slightly different approach, when we were speaking to some of the other witnesses, again around ethical standards and ombudsman, they were talking about, because they interact with the broader public, and it isn't always clear to a member of the public who has a frustration, whether it's with their GP or the Parliament or a member of their local council, who to go to. So they were talking about creating a sort of one-stop shop, a website or portal or similar, so that you can go there and enter what your problem is, and then behind the scenes it would direct you to which of these public trust bodies was the one that was most likely able to help you. Is that something that would be your office could participate in? Would that help the public that use your services, or is that not going to be relevant to you?
It wouldn't help me, because I have particular requirements, legal requirements for applications and so on, so it wouldn't really help. What I have done, though, is, well, first of all, we discussed that as commissioners last year about potentially having a portal that would, very light touch in terms of, if you need to speak to make a complaint about somebody, go and speak to whichever authority it was, whichever commissioner it was. That was something we considered. To be honest, events have overtaken us in some ways with this committee. But what I do have on my website is that when people use their information rights, I've been very keen to say, so what now? And that's a really important thing for me, is in terms of, so you've got a problem you've identified, so what do you do with it next? And if you're not happy about a service, I've got on my website, if you're not happy about the police, here's the details for PERC. If you're not happy about how an MSP has conducted himself, here's the details for Standards Commission. You know, and it's all these different agencies that we do that. But again, it's more than 7. It's very broad. So if people are not happy about fire, who do you go to? And this is it's what we're trying to do is have a clearing shop, and if people identify health and safety issues, here's a health and safety executive you speak to. It's not just a commission, it's a much wider thing. It's a living page in terms of, as we see more things coming through, we will add them onto it. So if you need to take this forward, here's where you take it. Certainly the Children's Commission and I have got a day in the diary to sort of try and chat this through as to how we can take, particularly for children's rights being taken forward when I'm very keen for them to use freedom of information legislation, and I'm very keen for them to be able to have something at the end and be inspired by what it is. There's no point in asking a question and then nothing. It's got to be the follow-on from that. Who does that? So we're going to explore that and see if there's something that we can do where we have a follow-through of, here's the, if it comes to us, here's a decision we've made, and you may want to go and speak to this advocacy service or this commissioner to take it forward. And I think that's probably, for me, a great use of my sort of website to sort of try and take people through for it. I don't think, if people have, the legislation requires people who refuse information to put the appeal rights on as to where to come. So every single appeal that we get has come through a process where somebody has been told, if you want to appeal this, go and see the Scottish Information Commissioner at the following details. So I would get nothing from it. I'd see no benefit from it. And certainly people should not be coming to me if they're not happy about something. They shouldn't be coming to me first. They should be going to the authority first. So to be honest, it would probably just cause more problems for me getting involved in that than it would be, otherwise.
Thank you, convener.
Thank you very much. Now turn to Richard Leonard.
Morning, Mr. Hamilton. You've already used some of these labels yourself, and some of the terminology has been part and parcel of the first half an hour of the session. But could you define yourself as being a regulatory or an advocacy commissioner? Is part one of my question. Part two of my question is, and you've covered this especially with the questions Lorna Slater asked to some extent, to what extent are you simply reactive, and to what extent are you proactive in your statutory duties?
So I'm a regulator, but I'm also an advocate of the legislation, not of people. Distinct difference there. So my duties under the Act are both to regulate in terms of making adjudications on appeals, but also to promote and progress the freedom of information legislation. So I have a team that is their function, which is to promote, to train, to encourage people to use it, advise in regulatory positions, and that's a key part of it as well. So that kind of moves into the second part, is that I'm both reactive and proactive. I'm reacting to the demand that comes into me from my enforcement team, which is on one side of the organisation, but I've got another team that are actually trying to drive that demand by encouraging people to use freedom of information, and that's what we've seen, a massive increase in that. I think that we had 96,000 last year, which is again another 10,000 jump in FOI volume, and consequently we always have a similar number of appeals come to us. So I'm conflicted in the sense I've got one team trying to generate more work and another team trying to keep up with it. So both.
Yeah, not an uncommon problem in the public sector. But you mentioned in your written submission about 500 appeals per annum.
Yeah.
So just going back to reflect on those figures you've just given us, can you tell us how many applications you receive or how many approaches you receive and what that then translates into? I mean, if you're talking about 90,000 and down to 500, seems like quite a massive drop.
It is. So I mean, this is the success of freedom of information is that 86% of people get the information they're looking, get a response in time, yeah. And then most people will get the information they're getting. I think it was 70. I can't remember the exact figures, but it is successful as a piece of legislation. The difficulty comes is that about, I think it's, I'll have to try and remember my figures here, but I think it's about 3% end up going to review, or 30%, I can't quite remember, but of those, then some come down to us. So we get about 0.6% consistently of all the freedom of information requests made across the country. So of the 96,000, you cut that down, and that's where we get about 500 to 600 requests. Those are always, though, the difficult ones. Those are the challenging ones. Those are the ones that need a lot of time, and some of the investigations can be very, very involved.
Yeah, and I'm sure some of these figures are in your annual report, so feel free to supply us with a kind of written summation of the answer to that question about how the
happy to do so, yes, of course.
That would be great. You say in your written submission that you've got strong statutory enforcement powers. Do you have all of the powers that you need?
I think I could do with some more. And I've certainly fed that, and I and my predecessors have fed that back to a number of consultations. I do think that there's the powers are very useful just now, and by and large we see compliance. There are, however, gaps which I think need to be addressed. And, for example, the deliberate deletion of information when there's not an appeal is something which is a loophole which I think needs addressed. And if legislation progresses, as it may do with the private members' bill, then that may be something that the Parliament may wish to consider.
Okay, but that would be a change in the law rather than necessarily a change in your powers. Or, I mean, are there examples where your powers are insufficient and you feel as though if you had more power, it would give you, it would lead to better outcomes? Yeah,
but the power comes from the law. So I would need a legislative change to allow me to exercise those powers.
Okay. Let me move on to another area. And again, this might be require quite a short answer, actually, because you've touched on this already, which is around, you know, you've made it clear both in your evidence this morning and in your written submission that you see yourselves very much as a standalone commissioner. I mean, to what extent do you collaborate with other public bodies to enhance the overall effectiveness both of your role and their duties and position?
So I break it down into two different areas, functional and corporate. So in the functional perspective, that's where we are going out doing training sessions. We have a very good stakeholder network. We attend sector groups and we give them updates on and encourage collaboration between them. So again, that's part of my policy team that are going out there doing that and being very proactive in pulling people together. The learning that we give out through newsletters, for briefings and so on, gets very, very good responses. We're doing webinars. We get a huge number of public authorities that sign up to those. So we're very much, on a functional perspective, working with public authorities. And I'm currently going around seeing a lot of chief executives, making sure that freedom of information is not seen as a low-hanging fruit, and that they need to make sure that it's resourced and not cut. Because again, in the financial climate, that's something that I'm beginning to see. In terms of the corporate side of things, what we're trying to do is everything at the back of my mind is thinking about shared services. It was kind of drilled into me at the beginning by the corporate body, and it's something which is very much tattooed on my forehead in terms of can we do this a different way? Can we find it what it is? So we've and there's quite a lot of, I think, very good evidence of where we've done things like common payroll. We're looking at different projects as to how we can do that. For example, I'm looking at Power BI training for my staff. Have offered that up. We were looking at...
Sorry, what's that?
It's data analytics, essentially. So it's business analytics, business information that allows... it's what I use to manage my caseloads and to display those in a visual way to the public. So if you go to my website, you can find out what my caseload looks like, what its performance is. You see public stats data. It's very much about that visibility and transparency. And so we've offered that up. I think one of the officers is going to put some staff on that as well. So we're trying to share things as much as possible. We have looked at, we have discussions about accountancy services. We have discussions about auditors and so on. So all of these things are, the presumption is that we try and see can we do it as a shared service amongst us. Again, we also have the benefit of parliamentary frameworks, so we'll often use that. And if we can get access to government frameworks, and perhaps the best example of that is the IT system, which a lot of the commissioners use, is the same Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament one, which yourselves use. So that is something where we are constantly looking to see, is anyone else doing this? First question is, when we look at this, is anyone else doing this, and is there a scope for us to jump onto a framework at some point? Now, sometimes those frameworks aren't suitable, which is just what it is. But that's our first question: is can we share it with somebody?
Okay, thanks. I've just got one final area of questioning, which I'm here as a backbench Labour MSP, but I'm also the convener of the Public Audit Committee, and you've mentioned conversations you've had with the Auditor General. I mean, may I say to you that some of the points you make in your written submission did ring some alarm bells with me. So, for example, you talk about being financially hamstrung. When it comes to being more accountable, you say it detracts me and my small team away from our core business. And thirdly, you speak about the disproportionality of the governance model. Now, propriety, accountability, governance are regular areas that get public bodies into trouble, and they end up coming before the Public Audit Committee.
Indeed. I think, though, that's the Spice briefing you're reading as opposed to my submission, which, if you look at that, was actually...
No, I read your submission last night, Mr Hamilton. That was in your submission.
Yes,
Wasn't it? Sorry, can we just clear this up? Did you use the expression financially hamstrung?
I absolutely did. Yes,
Did you say
I'm
it
talking
detracts,
about the context in which that's...
Did you say it detracts from me and my small team away from our core business?
In the context
was they your words or Spice's words?
In the context of additional governance and scrutiny.
Accountability was the issue.
No, I think it's to do with additional... What I said was, in that particular thing, and this is where the context matters, was that if you're looking for additional scrutiny and accountability, very happy to do that. I also said that I valued it and appreciated it in all of the submissions which I do. However, if there's to be further, then that does take away a small team from doing that. Now, that is the pleasure of the Parliament to do so, and of course I will comply with that. I'm simply raising the aspect that if you do that, there's a cost to it, and that would be in terms of performance of the other functions which we do.
But you spoke about cost-benefit analysis, opportunity cost. They're your words, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm clear about it. Don't want to get this confused. And the disproportionality of the governance model.
Yes.
Do you want to elaborate on that? Well, first, are they your words?
They are. They are
your words.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on what you mean by that?
So in the context of my submission, what I was making the point there was that and this chimes with the conversation I had with the Auditor General, was that the model which we have for audit is the same model that is used by all of the public authorities, some of which are 100 times bigger than some of the Commissioners' offices. And when we're looking at that, we're thinking, this is really, it's a never-ending cycle of constant audit for us and, preparation of reporting and so on. So, I mean, basically, I've got probably a full-time member of staff just reporting on all the different functions. And there's a sympathy which both Audit Scotland and I believe the National Audit Office have as well with that position, because they're saying, well, we see that this is perhaps the model is disproportionate for small organisations, and it's been minimised as much as it can through materiality, but it still requires this to happen just now. And at the moment, I'm going through pre-audit planning, which is just a constant stream of questions, which, frankly, we're thinking, oh, my goodness, really? Nothing has changed since last year, but it all has to be processed, ingested into systems, uploaded, and so on. And I think where my plea is that we examine what an appropriate level of accountability is. Taking into consideration all your concerns, it's an important function, but it has to be proportionate. And when I look at what we collectively are having to do, multiplied by 7, there's an efficiency there. Now, whether that's we have an audit that's we're part of the parliamentary audit, that's something I'd like to explore. But the difficulties become then in legislative terminology, because it's about accountability is invested in the legislation. So it would need to be a legislative change that would allow for some of these. So the barrier to that is actually our founding legislation, and it would need a change there. It's something which, as commissioners, we are all deeply frustrated about, but it's something we just have to do. In terms of the financially hamstrung, that relates to the fact of the carryover, so that we have to, it's not a budget, I think I said in my paper, it's not the budget, it's the expenditure, which I'm authorised to do. So if I am given a budget, it's not that I can spend it. I can only spend what the expenditure, authorised expenditure is. If there are savings, they're just lost. If I can't spend something by the end of the financial year, I'll lose it. It doesn't roll over. So I can buy it on the 27th of March because I've got money. I can't buy it on the 2nd of April because I don't. And that's the frustration, and it's something that the auditors themselves have picked up, saying, this is crazy. You don't have any ability to do medium-term financial planning. And I agree. And I think that's a problem which, you know, it's not a unique problem. I understand that other organisations, you know, I saw it in policing, same issue there. I think it's in the Parliament as well to a degree in terms of, you know, annual budgets, but it's something which I think it's appropriate to look at and see if there is something we can do with that. It would be great.
Just one final point from me then. Did you say earlier on that your staff complement is around about 28?
Yeah.
Yeah, because 24 hours ago, the Public Audit Commission was taking evidence about the Water Industry Commission, which has had 2 years of Section 22 reports because of problems of governance, of value for money, of propriety and accountability and so on. And they've just got 21 members of staff. So size isn't just a question that allows you to obviate from accountability, audit and scrutiny. It's actually quite important that those rules of transparency and accountability are in place.
It is. And I don't know who regulates them, and I don't know who oversees their accounts. I don't know who looks at their annual reports.
Audit Scotland.
Well, what I'm saying is I've got a parliamentary oversight group here in terms of I go to the Standards Committee and present my annual report. I get questioned on my accounts. I get looked at the performance there. And that's what I think is one of the strongest things, is the fact that I'm getting that scrutiny, and I take a lot of comfort from that, because it focuses my mind as to I need to be able to account for this to that committee. The more concerning is when you see some of my colleagues are saying that they're not getting that scrutiny, and that's because, and that's not for want of them trying. And I'm sure they'll speak to themselves on that, but what I would say is that I am comfortable with the fact that I get scrutinised by the corporate body twice a year and by the Standards Commission, by the Standards and Public Appointments Committee. Beyond that, and would be happy to give additional information as possible. I think the point I was making was that if I do further reporting and so on, it does have a cost to the organisation, and it takes us away from doing other important work. And it's just getting that balance.
Okay.
I think I'll move it on with respect, Mr Leonard. I think I appreciate with your other, you may want to pursue some of these with the other committee, and thank you both for that exchange. Ash Regan.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning.
Morning.
I also want to ask you about the mechanisms around the accountability and scrutiny functions. So in your written submission, you suggest, as you've done in your exchange with Richard Lind, that you feel it is appropriate, that it is robust. Annual reports obviously feature as quite a main part of that scrutiny, certainly for the committees in the Parliament. You suggested in your written submission that there's ways that could be made more effective. Could you explain?
Yeah, I think one of the comments I made was when it comes to the giving evidence at the Standards Committee, well, I did it earlier this month, so that was February. The report was laid in Parliament in September, October, but that was for the year before, so the events that happened up into April last year. So the reality is that what we end up doing is talking about the here and now at the Standards Committee, and that's great. Actually, it's more useful and more helpful. I just flagged the point that events happening in 23-24 are not looked at until 25, so there's a time lag there. Okay. It doesn't cause me a problem, but I just think it is a slightly curious thing as to the lag there. So if there were problems, the Standards Committee is not cited on them until quite a long time after the event.
Okay. And obviously there's a number of different types of accountability and scrutiny that are interacting together. So you've got the corporate body, you know, the Standards Committee, Audit Scotland. How do you think, from your perspective, that they are working together? And is there anything that could be done there that could improve that further?
I think again, it's kind of splits out on function. So the corporate function is more based upon the corporate body. So they need to understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, because ultimately they're my paymaster in terms of if I need additional resource, I go to them and they need to tell them why I need that additional resource. And they can make a decision upon that. The Standards Committee is more looking at the overall picture. It's looking at the whole system, I suppose, in terms of how it's working. So that's more of the functional perspective. But nobody has ever questioned me upon the decisions which I have to make, and correctly so, because the courts are the appropriate place for that one.
Okay, and just one final question. Your organisation obviously publishes a lot of data sets on performance indicators like KPIs and so on. I guess, in your case, against the functions set out in the enabling legislation, not all the supported bodies have that, but would you suggest that all the supported bodies should be publishing the same sets of information?
I don't know if they can. I mean, again, it occurs to me, or observing, I say, is the outputs are different. I mean, again, it goes back to the debate as to what is a KPI for, and you know, does it have value in its measures? Some things do. I mean, I think for me, you know, being able to get an average of your cases closed within 4 months is entirely appropriate, because there's an expectation that you get things dealt with. But of course, it's an average, because some people's cases will last 2 years of investigation because of the complexity of them. Some people will be a few days. It depends on the circumstance. So it's what does it tell you, I suppose, is a question. And I do also fear that sometimes KPIs are seen as an easy way of governance, where people look at it and say, oh, you've ticked the boxes there. But as we know, KPIs can also drive bad behaviours, and that's an unintended consequence sometimes of them. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ash Regan. Do colleagues have any further questions? If I may just ask one last question, and it's quite broad, but I think it's important to ask at this time. You talked quite rightly about the need for organisations to make sure that they have resource for responding to freedom of information requests. And I know from my experience how much time is also taken responding to the important right of freedom of information. Yeah. But in recent weeks, there's been some discussion in the public domain and the parliamentary domain about the use of portfolio questions perhaps being overly used and irresponsibly used, arguably. And I wondered if you wanted to say anything just about the responsible use and engagement with freedom of information by whether it be parliamentarians, journalists, the general public, just in that space around resourcing for yourselves, for other bodies. If you have nothing to say, I appreciate that's a broad question, but I just thought it was relevant in this wider context of prudence.
I think if people make the application, they have a right for that. So it's not for me to judge whether it's appropriate or not. I think the big thing which and you can expect to hear more of this from me over the years of my office, will be publication, proactive publication, and putting stuff out there. And a lot of the arguments for not doing that have been basically, oh, it's data dumping. Well, it's not data dumping, because we have great things called AI machines and search engines and so on that can find that information. So the big thing I would suggest is that if we can get into a culture of proactively releasing information, then a lot of the problems, and particularly a lot of the costs, go. It's why I've taken the approach on publishing my caseload data, so that if anyone asks what the caseload data is, just what's on the website. You know, it's there. It's all up front. I'm publishing all my corporate data that I can up front, so that I don't have to deal with any requests regarding that. So what I'm trying to do at the moment is pathfind for public authorities and public bodies to say, does it really need to be secret or kept back? You know, why are you not just putting it out there? Now, if it's read or not, it's irrelevant because there's frankly very little cost in it. Just put it out there. And my aspiration is that my senior management team will be able to look at papers for meetings, not as a, you know, sort of, these have not been released and then publishing them, but looking at live data on a website and saying that's our data, that's what we're making. And our decisions then, our papers then become about the decisions and how we react to that public data. It's not a case of saying, well, can we approve this data for release now? It should be out there. It's public data. It's public has paid for this and they want to see what's going on. The important thing is how you respond to that. It's not about hiding it. So I think there's a cultural shift that's required here in terms of if you put stuff out, it solves problems. I would say also that my experience has been quite surprising in terms of some of the issues that I thought would be issues have not been issues. So if you get some of the contentious issues, maybe the GRR sort of issues, the hate monster, some of the parliamentary standards issues that have appeared, they've actually been dealt with very well by the authorities that have been dealing with them because they've geared up to it and they've dealt with it. Sometimes it's the small things that don't that cause the problems. Is the things that are not in the highlights. So we didn't get inundated with requests about all of these things. I expected we would, but it's because the public authority was on it and thinking about it and proactively doing things, proactively publishing, proactively and responding quickly and on time to things. So that's what can be done. If we could just expand that to everything, then the whole system would be a better place.
Thank you for providing Parliament with your thoughts on those matters. Is there anything, Mr Hamilton, that you wanted to say today that you haven't had a chance to emphasise to us?
No, I don't think so. I think we've covered a lot. Some of it, you know, I think probably the main theme that I've said for me is that there are opportunities in the broader public services to look at more helpful and more productive reforms rather than just looking at the commissioners, because I think it's a convenient basket, but I don't think there's a lot of space in there that's going to give a lot of productivity at the end of it.
Thank you for that and for all of your reflections and answers today. Thank you for your written submission and thank you in advance for the follow-up letter and further correspondence that you gave an undertaking to Mr Leonard, and for your time.
Very welcome.
I now suspend this meeting for a few minutes to change witnesses. Thank you. Welcome back, and I'm really pleased to welcome to the committee now Dr Brian Blastow, Scottish Biometrics Commissioner, and Ross MacDonald, Director of the Scottish Biometric Commissioner Office. Thank you for being with us today and for your written submission as well, and for your time. We move directly to questions, and similarly to as we've asked other witnesses in recent weeks, the first question is from me, and I would just be grateful if you could set out what do you consider to be the purpose of the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner, and how does this differ from the role of ministers, MSPs and other bodies for the public and common good of Scotland?
I mean, thanks for the question. I mean, I think if I was answering that question to a public audience, I would just simply say that the purpose of the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner is to exercise independent oversight of how 3 policing bodies in Scotland acquire, retain, use and destroy people's biometric data. And by that I mean primarily fingerprints, DNA and photographs and recordings that are either taken from people because they've been arrested or are taken from people because they've been victims of crime. So that would be the generic answer we give, but obviously the function that we do comes from the Scottish Biometrics Commissioners Act of 2020, passed by the former Parliament, and the function is to support and promote the lawful, effective and ethical use of biometric data for policing and criminal justice purposes in Scotland. So the 3 important words in that statement are lawful, effective and ethical. So in discharging that kind of specialist oversight role, how our function differs from Parliament is, of course, you people are all elected by the public. I'm in essence elected by you guys because as an independent office holder of the Parliament, we are all appointed by a committee of MSPs. So yeah, it's a kind of specialist policing function that we do, and in doing that we work very closely with other bodies working in the criminal justice arena, is what I would say. About 99% of our work's proactive, because if you are charged with keeping the law, policy and practice under review, you can't do that from behind your desk, so you have to get out there and you have to ask probing questions. Does that answer your...
Yes, I appreciate it was quite a broad question, yeah. But I think your remarks are helpful, and of course, as you stated in your written submission, there's a specialist independent oversight function that you have, and also, interestingly, that you're the newest commissioner.
Yes, I'm the oldest and also the newest at the same time.
So, you know, in that context, it'd be interesting, and your written submission was really helpful because you didn't just talk about your function and body, but yes, you actually spoke to the wider challenge that we've been yes, given by the Parliament and more broadly. So, do you want to talk a bit more about what you perceive the current role of the SPCB supported bodies to be in enhancing public trust and confidence in public life in Scotland, both in terms of your responsibilities, but anything more widely that you want to emphasise?
Yeah, I mean, happy to do all of that. I mean, I think I said in my written submission and in previous evidence to the Finance Committee that, you know, this landscape has evolved organically since about 2002. And when I was appointed in 2021, I was probably the first commissioner since about 2008, 2009, something like that. And of course, were you to design that system today from scratch, you would design it very differently. So I suppose my starting point in all of this is I don't actually think that the existing landscape is not fit for purpose. I think that's unhelpful language to use. I would prefer to say that there is room for significant improvement in the landscape. And by that I mean I think there are opportunities for better scrutiny, more accountability, more sharing of services, more collaborations. And I actually, my personal view is that the key to unlocking some of that is to have a kind of hub and spoke model, as I would call it, where you have a kind of centralised engine room, if that's not the wrong word, which provides the kind of mission critical corporate functions such as finance, HR, financial processing, etc. And that the spoke element is where the independent office holders then discharge their very different mandates that they have, because they are very different, and whilst all of them arguably involve an element or component of public trust, the word trust doesn't feature in most of their legislation. So it's about, I think, an opportunity that presents itself at the moment to reframe that landscape in a better, more effective and efficient way, and in a way that provides probably better value and more transparent value to the public. If that answers your question.
That does, and it's also helpful for what colleagues will come in with in due course. First of all, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Just to follow on that first point from the Convener, one thing the committee is interested in is looking at synergies between the work of current commissioners. We heard from the Information Commissioner just before you came in. Are there, in your view, any synergies or overlaps between the work you do, for example, and that of the Information Commissioner?
So there are no legislative overlaps in terms of our primary mandate. But of course, what we all share in common is that we're all appointed by the Parliament and that we are all funded by the Parliament Corporation. So that necessitates, if not demands, sharing of services, because otherwise you end up with a series of 7 cottage industries if you don't do that. So one of the things when I was appointed was, and perhaps because I was appointed mid-pandemic at a time when it was not legally permitted to physically meet with anybody, it was both desirable and necessary for me to enter into a shared services arrangement at the outset, because I didn't want to rush off and recruit staff at all. I wanted to think about how this function should be properly structured to provide best value for the public purse. So, and I think the model that we have, I mean, I have 3 full-time staff, only 3 full-time staff. Ross has joined me for a period of 2 years on temporary secondment from Police Scotland. That is partly about bringing some ready expertise into the organisation to help us over a kind of demanding period. But it's also a developmental position, because nowadays in the world of policing, there are very limited opportunities to gain exposure to everything that goes with governance in a small public authority. So I think we provide proof of concept that the shared services model can work. I mean, we are, I'll say again, very small, but we have successfully operated now for nearly 4 years. Our audit, annual reports and accounts have been cleared by Audit Scotland. So the proof of concept has withstood external audit and scrutiny. We now have at Bridgeside House, where we're based, the Scottish Human Rights Commission and the Children's Commissioner now buying in, if that's not the wrong phrase, to the shared services model. And so I think we need more of that. We need more shared services. We need more collaborations. But the other point I just wanted to make, which I did in my evidence submission anyway, is we shouldn't confine that partnership working to only within those 7 bodies. So, for example, I operate in the criminal justice space. I meet regularly with Chief Inspector of Constabulary, Chief Inspector of Prisons, Chief Inspector of Prosecutions, Park Commissioner, Chief Inspector of Fire and Rescue. We have almost like a informal peer support network, if that's not the wrong way to describe it. So there are also opportunities for further shared services and or collaboration in that space. I'll give you one example. We because we only have a small budget, we don't have our own media function, for example. So we use, through His Majesty's, as it is nowadays, Chief Inspector of Constabulary, we use their media person to do our media. And we'll be laying a report in Parliament next Wednesday, where we have done a really detailed review of DNA. Can't say too much about that until it's laid in Parliament, but we've done it in partnership with the Scottish Police Authority and the Leverhulme Institute of Forensic Science. We are also working at the moment with His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary on another review that will be laid in Parliament in about 3 or 4 weeks' time on how the police use retrospective image search technologies within two UK databases, the Child Abuse Image Database and something called PND, Police National Intelligence Database, which is a UK intelligence system. So the point of sharing these examples with you is that we actually work very proactively in partnership with not only other bodies within the SPCB landscape, primarily the SPSO, who we have the shared services agreement with, but also with other partners in the criminal justice space. So that's a clumsy way of saying that we are advocates of and provide visible evidence of opportunities for partnership working, more collaborations, more shared services.
Thank you. That's a very helpful overview. And I'd just like to understand a little bit more about how the shared service model works in practice in terms of lines of accountability, who pays for what. So you referenced, as an example, the media output that is provided elsewhere. So how does that work in terms of your budget? Do you financially contribute to that? In practice, how does that work?
Yeah, so if we need to use a media professional because, for example, we're laying a report in Parliament, we will engage the services of that media professional on an hourly daily rate. Okay. So, you know, if, for example, when we lay the DNA report in Parliament next week, that might cost me 2 days of a media professional's time.
Okay. And would that same principle then apply to other functions such as finance and HR? No.
So originally, back in 2021, when I entered into a shared services agreement with Rosemary, the deal that was brokered through the Parliament Corporation was that I would surrender at that time, I think it was about £22,000 from my core budget in exchange for surrendering that amount. I would be given an office at Bridgeside House. I would be provided with my HR services to allow me to then recruit 4 staff, although I chose only to recruit 3. To do all my financial processing, facilities management, mail handling. Probably the best deal I ever made in my life, to be honest. But now I don't have to pay anything into it. So in essence, my budget would be graduated down the way, and the SPSO's budget graduated up to pay for the equivalent of half an extra member of staff.
Okay. And yeah, and effectively your budget therefore is top sliced.
Yes, exactly.
And money goes into the central pot.
Exactly.
That's very interesting. Okay, let me ask you a slightly different question, because we're looking at the criteria for creating new supported bodies, which is something that you reference in your written submission. And in that, you stress the importance of objectivity, and that there should always be a presumption against creating new commissioners. So based on your experience, what criteria should be prioritised? when considering creation of new SPCB supported bodies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the existing criteria that the Parliament has are the correct criteria. However, despite that, we sometimes end up in a position where, for example, you will have the Finance Committee saying that had the Parliament applied these criteria correctly, then we would not have moved forward with a patient safety commissioner. So I don't think there's anything wrong with the criteria. I think the criteria are the correct ones. But I suppose my broader point is that by its very nature, Parliament operates in a political environment, and sometimes it can be politically expedient to do something or not do something. And I suppose that's a challenge for Parliament. But, you know, we really should not be creating additional public authorities in Scotland unless there's an absolute need to do so. And quite often, there is another way of achieving the same result, I think. You know, so if you think about the Patient Safety Commissioner, for example, then the issues that gave rise to the perceived need for a Patient Safety Commissioner probably can be addressed in other ways. Those are matters for the Parliament. But I suppose my substantive answer to your question is that I do think the Parliament has the correct criteria and it needs to apply them.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we explored some of these issues with the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman when she was here in front of committee 2 weeks ago, particularly around the Patient Safety Commissioner issue. Okay, one more question, if I can, just again going back to your written submission. And you say you would encourage the Parliament to put budgetary control measures in place to ensure that the landscape does not grow exponentially over this parliamentary session and beyond. So can you expand on what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the current landscape, where you have 7 different bodies supported by the Parliament Corporation, I bet if you went back in time and looked at how many staff each of these organisations had when they were established, it will bear no resemblance to what they have now. And it's very, I suppose the point I'm clumsily trying to make is, if you are charged with running one of these organisations and you're under a bit of pressure or a bit of demand, it's very easy to go to the Parliament Corporation cap in hand and ask for more resources, and they may or may not give you them. But whenever you invest in more staff, then that's a long-term financial obligation. And isn't it funny that nobody ever disinvests in anything? You know, so you get this kind of unregulated growth.
But Dr. Plaster, you've done very well. You're employing fewer staff than you were intending. So you're an exemplar of what can be done.
Well, maybe I'm a control freak. I don't know, but no. I mean, on a serious point, I've worked in public services all my life, and I've always had a keen eye to the public purse. So if there's a better and more effective, more efficient way of doing it, then that's my job to ensure that happens. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now turn to Lorna Slater.
Thank you, convener. And we've talked a lot about this sort of complicated landscape. Your role and the role of your office is is the newest, but also I think probably the most specific and narrowest. And would it be right to say that this is largely as a result of changes to technology and I guess evidence gathering methods? So I guess part of my question is, as we look ahead to the future of the landscape, we can imagine that new technologies, AI, goodness knows what's ahead of us, might require other bits of data protection, good practice by police, and so on and so on. If we're imagining a robust shape for this landscape such that in the future other things are required, is that something that you imagine that you could be incorporated with your office? Would there be other commissioners? Like how do we make your function or the role you play in that wider landscape robust to future technological advance?
Yeah. So I'll give you a two-part answer to that question. So the first thing is to rewind a bit and say that in every one of my annual reports to the Parliament, I've highlighted opportunities for expansion of remit. And not once have I ever suggested that that would involve more resource. So one of the things that I have said to the Criminal Justice Committee and others is that biometric data is exchanged throughout the entire criminal justice ecosystem in Scotland. So it's exchanged between the police, the prisons, the courts, etc., etc. So it's a kind of artificial construct to restrict my functions to 3 policing bodies. Because when you then have good decisions by Scottish Government to invest in things like the digital evidence sharing capability, and you have biometric data then ingested into that system, then some of that system is beyond oversight. The other area that I often highlight is public space safety camera oversight. I've said before that I see that as a strategic gap in Scotland. We do not have a coherent public safety camera strategy. That could easily be put in place with a code of practice. Why that becomes important is I recently had a meeting with Liz Smith and Ross Greer broadly about questions of the extent of potential foreign state surveillance in Scotland. But all of that product that comes from public space, public safety cameras, only becomes within my statutory function once it's received by Police Scotland. So I don't have any kind of locus in the wider data-rich environment. So I suppose what I'm clumsily trying to say is there are opportunities to maximise the value that you get from your independent office holders, and those opportunities don't always involve additional cost. So, yeah, I probably went off on a tangent there and totally lost.
No, not at all, because one of the things we want to look at with this landscape is not just overlaps, but also gaps, where there is potential gaps. And it seems to me that we all have biometric passports now.
Yeah.
We can imagine a future where payments are made, systems are made by biometrics, where your library card has biometrics. Like, you can absolutely imagine that becoming a standard identification technique and so on. So when imagining this landscape, we need to make sure that gaps are covered and that it is robust, so that there isn't a sort of instinct to create a new commission every time a new thing is developed, that we create that. So no, thank you for your answer on that one. Partly just to help me to make sure I haven't made a mistake here, in sort of comparing your role to some of the other commissioners and parliamentary supported, I can't even say it, bodies that we've been talking to on this one, many of those have a very public-facing role. Am I right in thinking your role is entirely or nearly entirely not public? So public don't come to you when they've got a problem. Your role is about supporting the police.
The public do come to us when they've got a problem. So we have... one of our functions is to maintain a statutory code of practice. So members will remember that on the 16th of November 2022, the Parliament passed our statutory code of practice, and basically it's a principles-based framework which Police Scotland, the Scottish Police Authority and the PIRC must comply with. And that's accompanied by information gathering powers. It's accompanied by powers to serve information notices and compliance notices on, for example, Police Scotland, and it's accompanied by a public complaints mechanism. In the early years after the code was approved by Parliament, we did not receive any complaints, but that was mainly because Police Scotland, when they were arresting people, were not telling them that not telling them anything, to be honest. One of the recommendations we made from a report in 2023 was that, as happens everywhere else in the United Kingdom, if someone's arrested, you, the police, must tell the person why you're taking their data, what you're going to use it for, where you're going to store it, and who you're going to share it with. So as a result of that recommendation, and it took Police Scotland, this isn't a criticism, but it took them a year to produce an information leaflet. And what that means now is that in 90,000 custody episodes each year in Scotland, members of the public who are arrested and deprived of their liberty and who have their biometrics taken are given an information leaflet that explains all of that and also explains about the code of practice and about our function. And we have, in the last few weeks, received our first 2 complaints about the code of practice. So we do receive complaints from the public on a very small scale. Just to touch on something that you had asked David about earlier on, was we are absolutely proactive in putting information out. We use our, because of our small size, we use our public-facing website as an information repository. We publish almost everything, so we try to use that as a primary public engagement mechanism, but we also we do what we can. We engage in different forums. We speak at conferences. It's difficult when you're a tiny organisation to do a lot with limited resource and budget, but I think it works well.
And finally, for those aspects that are public facing, when someone has a complaint or wants to come to you for information, or they've had an issue with the police, something we've talked about with some of the other witnesses is a sort of one-stop shop. So if you're a citizen, citizen resident of Scotland, you've got a problem with a public service, maybe the police, and you don't know where to start because this is a complicated landscape, but you need help. Would a sort of one-stop shop, single portal be useful to people who access your services?
I think this goes back to maybe my first or second answer about this hub and spoke model. I mean, there already is, you've got to be good to find it, but you can go onto the Parliament website, for example, you can find the page that has the 7 independent office holders on it, and within that page is a link to each of our websites that explain what we do. But it's kind of clunky and it's not very easy, it's not very accessible, is probably what I would say. So I'm very attracted to, not to the proposition of creating a new body, because I think that's the last thing we should be doing, but I'm very attracted to the proposition of some re-engineering to create a kind of centralised shared service hub, even if that involves some of us surrendering resource to do that and having this kind of hub and spoke. That's just a personal view. I don't speak for any of the other office holders in that regard.
Thank you, convener.
Thank you very much. Now turn to Richard Leonard.
Thanks. I think, Dr. Plaster, you've answered some of my rudimentary questions, which are about the extent to which you're reactive and proactive, and you've said you're 90% proactive. One of the other related questions is, in this debate, people define certain commissions and commissioners as regulatory and others as advocacy commissioners. Where would you place yourself in that spectrum?
Yeah, I would say we're a specialist oversight body, is what I would say. I mean, our function in law is to support and promote. Those sound like advocacy words, but it's then the lawful, effective and ethical use of biometric data. And I think, as I said in an earlier answer, is you kind of need to know the right questions to ask to satisfy yourself that those 3 dimensions are being properly addressed. So, yeah, we kind of perform a specialist oversight function. We're an arm's length body of the Parliament, is what I would say. Members will remember that the former Justice Subcommittee on Policing under the previous Parliament had to invest a significant amount of time on looking at things like digital triage devices, Police Scotland's strategy / policy on facial recognition. And some members who've been around a lot longer will remember the Shirley McKee fingerprint scandal and how badly all that ended. So, yeah, I wouldn't want to pigeonhole us into any particular group, but I think specialist oversight's probably the best descriptor of of what we do.
Okay, that's fine. You also touched on, in response to an earlier question, about areas where you think your remit could usefully be extended. And I think, as Lorna Slater has described, this is an evolving set of challenges which you are going to come up against and try and proactively preempt. But are there aspects of your powers that you think could be enhanced, that would give you better outcomes to the work that you do?
No, because in the Scottish Biometrics Commissioners Act, the Act says that the Commissioner may do anything necessary or expedient in the discharge of his functions. That's quite wide-ranging. The specific powers that we have in the Act are, in relation to the Code of Practice, are the power to gather information. We have used that power, and we've used that. We have served an information notice on Police Scotland previously in connection with their ingestion of biometric data to the digital evidence sharing capability. The reason for serving the information notice was to find out whether the sovereignty of the data was being properly protected and whether the security of the data was being properly protected. We've never yet had to serve a compliance notice on the code. We have conducted 2 rounds of formal compliance assessments on the Code of Practice with the 3 organisations. The winter just passed, we found them all compliant with the Code of Practice. The year before, we found them all compliant with the Code of Practice. But I should say that in relation to Police Scotland, the compliance this year is conditional on them discharging the recommendations that were made jointly with Scottish Government last autumn in a joint review of the laws of retention. And to explain that in layman's language, we think Police Scotland are keeping biometric data for too long, and they are not reviewing the retention as they're required to do by law.
Okay. Final question from me, and you're very blunt in your written submission, contrary to Mr Hamilton's position, where you say individual corporate HQs are an unaffordable luxury.
Yeah.
So that's a clear statement of your view, and you're very strong on sharing services. Yeah. That comes through both in your evidence this morning and in the written submission we received. In your written evidence, you also alluded to the fact that you are dealing at times with, not directly perhaps, but dealing with the data around vulnerable adults, children and young people, and you also talk in your written submission about information rights. So the question I think we'd like to get an answer to is the extent to which you do collaborate, work with those other commissions. You know, if you're dealing with the treatment of the biometric data of young people and people below the age of 18 and so on, do you have conversations with the Children and Young People's Commissioner and understand or a human rights approach to some of these questions? What is the extent of your interaction?
No, it's a great question. Thanks for asking it. So one of the things in the Act, under I think Section 33, I can't remember off the top of my head, I'm required by the Act to maintain an advisory group. And on the advisory group are Scottish Human Rights Commission and the Children's Commissioner, the 2 that you reference. Others, UK Information Commissioner sits on my advisory group, a number of academics, Leverhulme Institute of Forensic Science, etc., etc. So through the professional advisory group, we engage with the Scottish Human Rights Commission and the Children's Commissioner on a regular basis and on specific pieces of work. So in our legislation, one of the requirements on the Commissioner is that the Commissioner must, it's not discretionary, must have regards to the interests of children and vulnerable people. And that is why when we, the very first 2 assurance reviews that we did, we intentionally chose to look at children and vulnerable people for those reasons, a legislative imperative. we actually did want to work with the Children's Commissioner on the Children's one, and at the time Bruce, who was the Commissioner, had indicated they weren't, but they couldn't resource it, so we defaulted to the Children and Young Persons Centre for Youth Justice. Likewise, on the vulnerable adults piece, we tied in with COSLA through the Vulnerable Adult Network in Scotland, and brought other practitioners, subject experts into the field. So we do work very heavily in partnerships with others, because it's more effective and efficient to do so, and it allows a tiny organisation like mine to punch above its weight by working collaboratively with others.
Thanks, that's very useful. Thanks. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much. Ash Regan.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to move on now to accountability and scrutiny mechanisms. You'll know that the committee, we're very interested to know if the scrutiny that you are receiving is robust, if you feel that it's appropriate. So could you give us your view on how you're scrutinised, and if you think there's more effective ways that that could be done?
Yeah. So I think I've indicated in my written submission that I don't receive as much scrutiny as I'd like to, or not as often as I'd like to. It's probably a better way to phrase it. So I'll have been in post for 4 years in April, and by April I will have laid 11 reports in Parliament, 3 annual reports and an operational report, 5 assurance reviews, because there's one coming next week and one coming 3 weeks after that, a strategic plan, code of practice. I've only appeared before the Criminal Justice Committee twice. That's not a criticism of the Criminal Justice Committee, because they're a whole economy committee, and they've got massive issues on their plate. But I would expect, as an office holder, to be called before the relevant committee at least once a year. And I think that the right time to do that would be between November and, say, March, after the annual report has been laid, because obviously if Audit Scotland pick up on any issues, then that's the opportunity for the relevant committee to hold us to account. So that's on the parliamentary bit, and of course we're always happy to appear before committees like this, or the Finance Committee. In relation to the Parliament Corporation, we appear before them in person once a year. Ross and I have just been this morning. And as with the Criminal Justice Committee, the actual scrutiny itself is very robust, it's very intrusive, but supportive at the same time. But again, with the Parliament Corporation, I would like to appear before them twice a year, because roughly about the first week in August every year, we are asked to submit our budget submission for the following year. Our budget is always just based on our static staffing model, plus normally whatever the inflation figure is we're asked to use, with the exception that obviously we got Ross in temporarily for a couple of years. But I think it would be better practice for the Parliament Corporation to look office holders in the eye, particularly where they're making any growth bids around staffing, etc., and to absolutely satisfy themselves that those are absolutely required.
Okay, so just to summarise, you think increased frequency, both by the corporate body and possibly by committees, although obviously we all understand there are capacities issues with the Justice Committee, which is why I think in the last session they had the subcommittee, didn't they, on policing, which gave extra capacity. But can I just pick up on that point, the number of reports that you mentioned there? You feel that there's a number of those that really you're not getting any sort of scrutiny on, those reports that you've produced?
I think what I'm probably trying to say in a very clumsy way is that providing the office holders are called before the relevant committee once a year, and that happens, then that's an opportunity to cover both the annual report and any other relevant reports that have been laid in Parliament over that period. So I wouldn't expect, for example, the Criminal Justice Committee just would not have time to to see us every time we publish a report. And I wouldn't expect that, but once a year would be good if it's achievable, and it would allow all the business to be swept up in one session.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And just in that space, the 6 key recommendations that you gave were interesting and helpful in the written submission. The last one, 6, you say Scottish ministers and Parliament should review the functions of all SPCB supported bodies every 5 years. Yeah. I just wondered if you wanted to say a bit more about that. It's an interesting suggestion.
It's just a personal view, and it goes back to the point that I made earlier on that, and I saw this in policing over about 4 decades. Is, you know, you continually invest in new things and take on new duties and responsibilities, but organisations are very bad at stopping to do things, and in the case of the Parliament office holders, it may well be that the particular set of circumstances that gave rise to their creation in 2002, whilst absolutely appropriate, maybe in 2032 or 2042 will no longer be relevant because the world will have changed. So I think. Just as a general principle, because you decide to invest in something, doesn't mean that you should stay with that model forever. So it's just a general principle.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful, and appreciate the candid way in which you've put it forward. And I reflect also on the evidence you gave to the Criminal Justice Committee, which I also sit on, and what you were talking about in response to Lorna Slater in terms of how. The different ways in which biometrics are utilised, where and how they may be utilised in the future, both here in Scotland and internationally. I mean, when I think back to what you said at the Criminal Justice Committee, you did give an indication that there might not be a necessity for your position in the future. And I don't know if you want to, just for the record, say that again or a bit more about it for the benefit of our committee.
I'm very happy to do that. I mean, I think some of the biometric technologies that we have been around for a long time. They weren't even called biometric technologies, so the police have been taking people's fingerprints in Scotland for over 120 years. They've been taking people's photographs for more than 120 years. DNA has been around since the late 1980s, and you can read all about that next Wednesday. There is a move now in policing. So at the moment we have a UK fingerprint database, and we share fingerprints with the EU and Interpol under certain conditions. And we have a UK DNA database, and we share DNA with the 27 member states and Interpol under certain circumstances. The European Union last year, year before, agreed something called Prüm 2, which is an extension of that framework. And so the European Union are going to start sharing people's facial images. And in due course, the UK will be invited to join that. There's a move by the Home Office and National Police Chiefs Council at the moment to create a single UK custody image database in the same way as exists for DNA and fingerprints. And to that new system will be applied artificial intelligence that will facilitate both retrospective facial matching and support live facial recognition for those police forces which choose to go down that route. So we're kind of on the edge of the next kind of digital revolution in biometrics and policing, where advanced AI-powered technologies are going to facilitate some of these issues around face. So there's going to be we're going to come to a kind of watershed moment in Scotland, probably in the next few years, where we're going to have to make a decision on what's right for Scotland in terms of this. Do we as a country support the use of live facial recognition by the police, or don't we, for example? But when we get beyond that, I could reasonably foresee a point in the future where the contentious nature of some of this comes off the political agenda. And so that was my broader point, which is we might in the future get into a more settled landscape where the Parliament is content that there isn't a need for independent oversight of this, or alternatively that it could sit with another organisation that already exists, you know. So does that answer your question?
It does, and it's helpful in the context of also your 6 key recommendations,
Yes.
and that 6th one in particular. So thank you very much for elaborating on that. Before we can conclude, I just wondered if there's anything that you wanted to say today or emphasise that you haven't had the chance to.
Well, I should have said at the start, if you've got any hard questions, ask. But no, I mean, I think, convener, the thing that I would just, the sort of parting thought that I would want to leave you with is, I'm not sure that I necessarily agree that the existing landscape isn't fit for purpose, but I do agree that there's room for significant improvement in the coordination of shared services and collaborative working. So I suppose that's my parting thought to the committee.
And that's very helpful, as has been all of your evidence today and your written submission. So thank you very much to both of you for attending and for your contributions and for your time. The committee next week will hear from the Scottish Human Rights Commission and the Children and Young People's Commissioner Scotland. That now concludes the public part of our meeting today, and as previously agreed by the committee, we now move into private session to consider today's evidence.